History as it happens, December 13th, 2024. Goodbye, Assad. Hello, who?
Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000 after his father, Hafez, had been in control since the 19th.
Opposition forces have reached Homs, where thousands of civilians have already fled. Meanwhile, Israel has moved...
Syrians hoped Bashar, trained as a doctor in London, would reform and modernize the country.
On the outskirts of Damascus, rebels storm Assad's notorious Sadnaya prison.
Islamist fighters took the capital, Damascus, yesterday.
Do you know what happened now? The dictator is gone.
Bashar al-Assad is gone. Syria's 13-year-long civil war at long last brought his tyrannical regime crumbling to the ground. A historic event few anticipated. The rebels who toppled him are Islamists, once affiliated with al-Qaeda. What's next for Syria? And how did the Assad dynasty hold on to power so long, more than 5 decades? That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
He'll be remembered as one of the most violent rulers in response to the uprisings that started in late 2010 in the Arab world.
I do, however, believe it's important to engage with Syria because Syria is going to be an important part of building a peaceful and stable future in the Middle East.
We understand the strong desire of the Syrian people that no foreign country should intervene in their struggle, and we respect their wishes.
No. We don't have no one's command. There was no command to kill or to be brutal.
Syria gained its independence from France in 1946, right? So the last French troops withdrew from Syria in 1946. And between 1946 and 1970, Syria had been in a political upheaval and experienced like 7 military coups, right? We're talking about a country that experienced 7 military coups in 14 years, right? So the authoritarianism that was formed and maintained by Hafez al-Assad provided authoritarian stability for 54 years.
Picture a street in Damascus, lined with people cheering their next leader. He arrives, flanked by bodyguards at a polling station. With our blood and our soul, we sacrifice ourselves for you, they say. No, this is not Syria today. This is July 2000, more than 24 years ago. Bashar al-Assad is the only candidate, and the outcome of the vote in a presidential referendum is not in doubt. 1 month after his father, Hafez al-Assad, died after 30 years in power. Now, in 4 out of the prior 5 referendums, all of them orchestrated by the ruling Ba'ath Party, Hafez al-Assad won at least 99.6% of the votes. Not bad. Spoiler, Bashar won this election and would remain in power, ruling with an iron fist until last week.
In front of Umayyad Square, which is in downtown Damascus, the center. As you can hear, people are pretty happy.
I cannot imagine we will arrive to this moment. Do you know what happened now? The dictator is gone.
And so ends a dynasty that'll be remembered for its tyrannical cruelty, as father and son unleashed the security forces on any and all dissenters, even children. They murdered thousands of Syrians and imprisoned and tortured thousands more. So this may be hard to believe, but when Bashar Assad succeeded his dad, there was optimism in Syria and foreign capitals. He released prisoners and promised economic liberalization and political reform. And in 2002, when Great Britain sought Syria's backing for the coming U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, because Syria shared a 600-mile-long border with that country, Prime Minister Tony Blair rolled out the red carpet for the dictator.
We've discussed, obviously, bilateral issues between the two countries, in particular how Britain can help with the continuing change and reform program in Syria, not least to do with information technology and with the banking system there. And we've discussed various ways that we can take that forward. Secondly, obviously, we've discussed the international situation. And of course, as you will be well aware, there are differences in view and emphasis about this, and we don't disguise those. On the other hand, it is good that both Syria and Britain backed the resolution in respect of Iraq. We, all of us, want to see the Middle East process resolved in a way that allows Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side together in peace. And we recognize that Syria has as much to gain as anyone from success in the fight against international terrorism. As I say, we do not hide where we disagree. Those disagreements are obvious and clear. But I believe that a process of engagement with Syria is the right way forward. And once again, I thank President Assad for accepting the invitation to come here and to have the talks with me.
أشكر السيد توني بلير على دعوته لكي أكون اليوم في بريطانيا.
I thank Mr. Tony Blair for his invitation for me to be today in Britain.
وأنا سعيد أن أكون هنا في بلد عشت فيها لمدة عامين.
And I'm very happy to be in a country in which I had lived for 2 years.
وعملت فيها كطبيب تعرفت فيها على المواطنين الإنجليز البريطانيين.
And in which I closely got to know British citizens.
We condemn totally anybody who's engaged in terrorist activity of any sort at all, wherever in the world. I do, however, believe it's important to engage with Syria because Syria is going to be an important part of building a peaceful and stable future in the Middle East.
Assad even enjoyed a photo op with the Queen.
But I used to work in Melbourne Road. But for a while I used to have course in King's College.
Oh, yes.
I used to pass by this.
I'm sure past the house, yes, indeed. Well, that's it.
But back home, his rule resembled his father's. And in 2011, the winds of the Arab Spring blew into Syria. Peaceful protesters were met with lethal brutality, provoking global condemnation.
This morning, President Obama called on Assad to step aside and announced the strongest set of sanctions to date targeting the Syrian government.
Yet in this interview with ABC's Barbara Walters, Bashar al-Assad denied it all.
Why was there such a brutal crackdown?
What happened?
Well, I'll give you some examples that I saw. A 13-year-old boy who was arrested in April. A month later, his body was returned to his family bearing scars of torture. A famous cartoonist whom you know, who was critical of you, badly beaten, his arms were broken. A singer, famous singer, who wrote a popular song calling for your ouster, he was found with his throat cut. You have seen these pictures, have you not?
No, but I
Is this news to you?
No, it's not news. I met with his father, with the father of that child, and he said that he wasn't tortured.
The cartoonist. The cartoonist who was critical of you, I've seen his pictures. His hands were broken, he was beaten.
Many people criticized me. Did they kill all of them? Who killed who? Most of the people that are being killed are supporters of the government.
In 2016, Vladimir Putin came to Assad's rescue, dispatching Russian aircraft to carpet bomb rebel positions in a civil war that would end the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. A civil war that froze in 2000. So it looked like the regime would survive until just a couple weeks ago. Rebel factions made sudden and dramatic gains, pushing all the way to Damascus.
At long last, the Assad regime has fallen. This regime brutalized and tortured and killed literally hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. The fall of the regime is a fundamental act of justice. It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria.
So who are these new guys? Well, there is HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, the main rebel group that toppled the regime. They're led by Ahmed al-Shara, whose nom de guerre was Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. They are Islamists. Al-Shara made his way into Iraq after 2003 to join al-Qaeda to fight the U.S. occupation. There is also SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, backed by the United States. They are Kurds. Kurds make up about 10% of Syria's population. During the civil war, SDF established an autonomous region in the northeast of the country. SDF is opposed by SNA, Syrian National Army, a ragtag group backed by Turkey. Now, Turkey opposes Kurdish militants, and Turkey also wants to send millions of Syrian refugees back to their homes. So take note, if you have a pen and paper, you can do it. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a designated terrorist organization by the U.S. and the European Union. SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, they're backed by the U.S., and the Syrian National Army, backed by Turkey. Druze militia and Islamic State fighters are also in Syria, and we have to note, in the past couple weeks, Turkey, the U.S., and Israel have bombed Syria for different reasons. So Syria's future is murky. Its past now coming into focus as its people celebrate the downfall of a horrendous dynasty. Sefa Secen is an expert on Syria and Middle East security at Nazareth University. He has been writing analysis essays about these remarkable events for theconversation.com, and I will share links to his work in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up for my newsletter free at historyasithappens.com. Sefa Secen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin. I'm delighted to be on this podcast.
So isn't the fall of Assad another example that we humans, when it comes to predicting the big events, we're simply not very good at doing it?
I think you're definitely right about this, right? So we failed to predict the major events in human history. Nobody was expecting the regime to fall at this time, right? So the attacks or the recent offensive were a surprise for the rest of the world. And it came at a time where Russia was tied in the Ukraine war. Iran and Hezbollah have suffered important setbacks due to Israeli airstrikes. Like, people were expecting the opposition factions to make territorial gains in Aleppo and perhaps move towards south a little bit, but nobody was expecting the regime to collapse completely. And when it comes to authoritarian regimes, on the one hand, they look very resilient, they look very strong, but they have also their own niches and vulnerabilities. And at certain points, they just collapse, and it's difficult to explain this.
Dictatorships are stable until they aren't. One of my recent guests made that point, Michael Kimmage, in the context of Putin and Russia. Even dictatorships need some popular legitimacy. Did Assad have any popular legitimacy?
I think all dictatorial regimes rely on some level of popular support, right? So you can't rule based on fear completely. But this doesn't mean that you get the support of the vast majority, right? So there are kind of different levels of support, varying degrees of support in different regimes. I would say the regime has relied on three instruments overall. The first one was this authoritarian toolbox where the regime never feared or avoided using sheer violence against its population, right? So we saw this in Hama in 1982. There was an insurrection started in Hama in 1976. It continued until 1982 when Hafez al-Assad actually ordered artillery fire on the city, and even chemical weapons were used. And the same
20,000 dead. 20,000 dead in 1982.
Somewhere between 10 and 25,000 deaths. And the same thing happened in 2013 in eastern Ghouta. Assad used barrel bombs against, civilians. So that's one thing, right? The regime never avoided using sheer violence against population. That created a culture of fear. And secondly, I think the regime for a long time has done a good job of playing on the ethnic and religious divisions within the Syrian society. It primarily relied on the minorities, like in terms of bringing them into the positions of power in intelligence and security apparatus. But it also, tried to appeal to the Sunni majority to some extent by bringing them into the positions of power in the parliament. For a long time, they played this delicate game of balancing ethnic and religious divisions within the Syrian society. And the third component here is the kind of international alliances. Both Father Assad and Son Assad, they build regional alliances and also international alliances. Russia has been an important ally of the Syrian regime, since 1970s. There was a security pact signed between the Soviets and the Syrians in 1956, right after the Suez War. And then there was another pact signed in 1980s. And this time around, during the Syrian civil war, Russia plus Iran plus Hezbollah were heavily involved in the war. Russia provided aerial support, bombed, Aleppo, and that was a turning point in the war.
Yeah, that was in what, 2013 or 2015, the carpet bombing?
That was actually in 2016.
2016, Russia carpet bombed Aleppo.
I think it tipped the balance of power in favor of Assad. The opposition factions were controlling almost like 70% of Aleppo, right? So if they captured Aleppo at that time, they could have captured other provinces, Hama, Homs, and Damascus eventually, right? So I would say like these are kind of three main factors that explain the longevity of the regime.
Yeah, the levers of power, institutions that he had at his disposal. You mentioned how he tried to cater to the Sunni majority. So yes, Syria is a Sunni majority country, but the Assad family is from an obscure Shia faction, or I don't know if you want to call it a faction.
From an Alawite family.
Alawite family. We'll get into the Alawites and who they were in a little bit. So what happened to the Syrian military? I mean, he needed it. You said that was one of the three legs underneath the stool, keeping the Assad regime in existence. What happened to the military here? It seemed to just fade away or melt away.
On the one hand, Syria, compared to other dictatorial regimes in the Arab world, had been the most resilient and strongest one, right? So like if we compare it with Tunisia, with Egypt, with Libya, we're talking about the longest lasting civil war here. And the civil war actually lasted 13 years, right? So the regime has been able to actually resist the change, this kind of transformative change for 13 years. So like, when compared with other regimes in the Arab world, we should kind of highlight the fact that this was perhaps the most resilient regime, dictatorship in the region. But when we talk about the recent phase of the conflict, I think you can definitely make the case that in the absence of international backers, the Russian aerial support, and then Iran and Hezbollah, were providing the ground forces, right? So like, I think these international alliances provided a lot of flexibility and power for the Syrian regime, which were absent in this recent phase of the conflict. So the Syrian army, military forces, so they had a huge repressive capacity, which helped it consolidate and maintain power. But when it comes to repelling or quelling this recent offensive, I think they failed because in the first place, HDS this time around was more organized and there were different factions being supported by Turkey, SNA, Syrian National Army. SDF had the American support.
And we're going to get into all these factions in a bit.
All of these factions, right? They seized the moment where, the Syrian army, although the conflict was in a stalemate since 2020, they still had fought a long civil war and they were still actually bombing Idlib despite the stalemate since 2020, right? So the army got tired of this long conflict and there was absence of international support, and the opposition factions took advantage of that.
Bad morale, low pay, from what I've read, a lot of younger recruits. I mean, it is a long war they were fighting, 13 years. So as you say, they were still capable of torturing people in prisons and dungeons, but maybe not fighting out in the field. The conventional wisdom now, Sefa, is Iran, Hezbollah, weakened by the war with Israel, Russia, distracted, weakened by its involvement, its war on Ukraine. Well, what's your take on this? Why didn't Russia do more to try to save him? It's hard to know what's going on inside the Kremlin. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. So I think it's difficult to guess. Russia was definitely overstretched. When you're fighting multiple wars, I would assume from a strategic point of perspective, you may find yourself compelled from moving a maximalist position to a kind of minimalist position in certain cases. And if the regime doesn't really have the manpower, military power, and if they have not completely aligned with your interests, I guess Russia was also in favor of a negotiated settlement between Turkey and the regime. Turkey tried to normalize relations with Syria, with the regime. Assad neglected and rejected all of these demands, right? So he had this whole arrogance that the regime would remain intact.
This is a situation of Gordian complexity. I recommend to everyone listening to us in another window or another tab or however you're doing it, pull up a map of Syria in the Middle East so you can see what we're talking about here, because this is a geopolitical struggle. I think what's tragic about Syria, Sefa, all of the countries that are involved in it to one degree or another, Israel, Turkey, Russia, Iran, are in it for interests that aren't the Syrian people's interests.
That's
so
very true.
I do want to get into the history of the Assad dynasty and also who are these other factions. I want people to come away from this conversation with some idea who we're talking about here. But one other thing about the current situation, because this is a fluid situation and things are going to change over the days and weeks and months as people listen to this. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the group that led the assault that brought down Assad. They were operating out of the northwest of Syria near the Turkish border. Who is this group? We know they used to be an offshoot of al-Qaeda. And who is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who has dropped his nom de guerre and now goes by his real name, Ahmed al-Shara?
So in 2016, they rebranded themselves as, Jabhat al-Nusra, and they cut ties, with al-Qaeda, right? Then they rebrand the group and call it, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. All of these were happening kind of in search of more international support because they didn't want to be affiliated with al-Qaeda anymore. It's a group of its own, right? So it doesn't have a lot of international backing. Turkey doesn't support this group. SNA, Syrian National Army, is supported by Turkey, but Turkey also designated this group as a terrorist organization. It was designated as a terrorist organization by the US, by many of the international actors, right?
And that is still the designation as we speak. So
yes, exactly. It's likely to change for some countries. I know that the UK is now reviewing the designation of HTS as a terrorist organization, right? So we're going to see what's going to happen on that front. The whole opposition, the Islamist opposition in Syria, was pushed to northwest, right? To Idlib. And there were also a lot of Syrian refugees living there. So, the movement took 3-4 years to build itself and launch this offensive. Mohammed Jolani himself, he was born in Saudi Arabia. His family was from Golan Heights. The Jolani, his last name actually literally means someone from the Golan Heights. After the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, he joins al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is how his jihadist career starts. 2011, he's involved in the Syrian civil war, in al-Qaeda in Syria, ISIS. And then he splits from ISIS and forms the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So far, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jolani himself are trying to kind of soften the image of the movement, the military group, in the eyes of the international community. They openly said that they don't target the West and they're not going to attack Israel in any ways. And they cleared their intention that they want to create a diverse, inclusive political system in Syria.
Yeah. So is that convincing, this conversion that al-Jolani is making, now Ahmed al-Shara?
So I think there are serious doubts that persist here. We need to be also a little bit optimistic in the sense that this is an historic chance for the Syrian people to create a political system that is inclusive, pluralistic, and relies on a form of effective governance, right? That's a historic opportunity. And I want to give the movement the benefit of the doubt here. So we will see whether actually they will be successful in, ensuring basic human rights and creating a sustainable political system in Syria. And we're talking about a fluid situation here, right? So still the control of different areas in Syria shifts between different groups.
Within Syria, when HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they set up what you might call a de facto autonomous or state within a state. They were governing part of, and they were pretty hard on the people within their governance, if you will, or whatever you want to call it.
So there was Salvation Government in Idlib, which was a de facto government formed by HTS. There were, skirmishes and fights between HTS and SNA, the other group in Idlib. You're right that they were kind of trying to impose type of political system on the individuals living there. So,
because Syrians may not want to live under a radical Islamist regime.
Yes, that's true. They don't want to live under a radical Islamist regime, and there are different factions of the opposition, right? SDF is primarily secular, and other factions, nationalist factions, are not Islamist either. So, politics is an art of compromise, and all of these factions need to make some compromises. I don't think SDF can completely move forward with its own autonomy and independence idea, because HTS and other groups are pretty much protective of the territorial integrity of Syria. So there will be compromises made, and I'm hoping that they'll create a political system that functions.
Well, it's hard to see that now, right? Because, as we said, this is just happening. And as you write in an article for theconversation.com, and I will share a link to this article in my weekly newsletter, You say a fragmented landscape. The fact that different opposition groups have taken control of various once government-held areas points to a crucial fact, you write. Syria is de facto partitioned. So making a cohesive single state when you have competing groups that are, as we speak, actually fighting each other in some parts of the country, how are you going to have a single unitary state? So let's talk about that one faction that you were just discussing, SDF. That is short for Syrian Democratic Forces. They are Kurdish-led, backed by the United States. Turkey does not see them as being democratic forces, if you will. They see them as linked with Kurdish, breakaway Kurdish forces. Talk a little bit about SDF and what would happen to it if the United States under Trump withdraws from Syria.
So they were the main U.S. ally during the fight against ISIS. They were providing ground forces, and then the U.S. was bombing ISIS targets in the region. So during this latest offensive, they also expanded their territories, right? So they captured Deir ez-Zor, which was actually recently captured by the other opposition factions as of yesterday. So like the conflict is very fluid. The HDS wants to build a workable, functioning relationship with SDF to some extent, because, you cannot completely take SDF out of Syria. They are an important actor that need to be reckoned with. If the U.S. withdraws from Syria, SDF would be losing its international support. They would be compelled, to negotiate with Turkey and other factions of the opposition to create a sustainable system in Syria. If they push for independence and autonomy, I'm not sure to what extent that would be welcomed by other opposition factions. And I don't know to what extent this could actually lead to new rounds of armed conflict in Syria.
That's right, because they're in the northeast of the country, and Turkey would not want an autonomous Kurdish region there. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who I don't want to call them the central government, they toppled the main force that toppled the regime.
Strongest, opposition faction.
If they want to consolidate power, they may not want a Kurdish autonomous region in the northeast of the country.
It has become apparent that Turkey doesn't want an autonomous Kurdish region in eastern Syria, and they have been involved in incursions into some parts of SDF-controlled areas, right? So if negotiations do not result in a kind of sustainable peace, there's still a high risk of armed conflict between these different factions.
In the northwest part of the country, there's also this thing called the Syrian National Army, which is a misnomer. This is a ragtag group of people that is backed by Turkey. Turkey, its air force has been dropping bombs in Syria this week. Israel and the United States have as well. Less attention paid to what Turkey is doing there. The Syrian National Army.
This faction in northwest Syria is primarily supported back by Turkey. And understandably, Turkey has been the country that has been impacted by this conflict to the largest extent. We're talking about 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And there has been increasing political pressures on President Erdogan to return refugees. They try to, facilitate diplomatic negotiations with the Assad regime, normalize relations. Those attempts have failed. And then they consider the military option and backing this opposition group. But they are also using these opposition groups in their fight against Kurdish autonomy. In Syria, Turkey has two primary goals in Syria. First, facilitating the return of Syrian refugees. Most of the Syrian refugees in Turkey are from Aleppo, so some of them have already begun returning. And secondly, this fight against Kurdish autonomy. And this goes back to Turkey's fight against PKK, this Kurdish military group since 1980s. Turkey sees SDF as an offshoot actually of PKK.
People may be listening to this podcast months from now, so I don't want to get into too many current headlines. I'll just mention one happening this week from the New York Times. Fierce fighting underway between rebels supported by Turkey versus the U.S.-backed Kurdish-led forces near Kobani, a town in northern Syria with historical and symbolic significance. So the civil war is not truly over.
The Nasser vision of a single great Arab nation collapses overnight as Syria revolts against his rule and proclaims itself an independent state. Anti-Nasser demonstrations broke out all through Syria after a pre-dawn army coup ousted governing Egyptians who passed the word to Nasser that his republic...
Okay, to the history of the Assad regime. You know, Syria is entering a new era now. We're not quite sure what it's going to look like and how long HTS might be able to hold on to power in Damascus. When Hafez al-Assad and his Baathists pulled off a successful coup in the 1960s, he took full power in 1970. There had been a coup a few years earlier. That was also the end of an era, if you will, in the Arab world, right? The Assad regime was replacing this Nasserite military officer class that had been ruling Arab states, Syria, Egypt, Iraq. It was called the officer state, but they made a mess of things, right? And they fell into disrepute, although Assad was an officer himself.
We need to understand the Arab Cold War here, right? And in order to understand the Arab Cold War, we need to go back to the Egyptian Revolution in 1952. In Egypt, King Farouk gets overthrown by Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser in a military coup.
Naguib inspects officers and men of his country's rapidly expanding cavalry. The new strong man of the Nile, who led the July coup of army officers that forced ex-King Farouk into exile, is building Egypt's military strength while carrying out land reforms. The eyes of the free world are on the well-drilled and well-equipped forces of General Naguib.
And in 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser becomes the president of Egypt. He is the ideologue of this Nasserism, right? This whole ideology was named after him. This ideology promotes pan-Arabism, creating a united Arab state, secular nationalism in the Arab world. And during the Cold War, there are ideological tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. And in the region now, we have this new kind of layer of Cold War where you have secular republics versus, monarchies, right? So monarchies are increasingly perceiving the secular republics as a threat. And in 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes Suez Canal, right? So when he nationalizes Suez Canal, that makes him a hero in the Arab world, and he also wins the victory, right? So the French and British and Israelis, they invade Suez Canal, but the Soviet Union and the United States want them to pull out, and they pull out, and it's a victory for Nasser, and that makes him a hero in the Arab world, increasing influence, and then we kind of see his influence bringing other Arab countries closer to Egypt. There is a united Arab state formed between, Syria, Egypt, and Yemen in 1958. That doesn't really last long.
It's called the United Arab Republic.
Republic, exactly. UAR collapses in 1961. In 1963, kind of connecting all of these developments to Syria, in 1963, there is a Ba'ath military coup in Syria. So the Ba'athist Party was formed in 1947 in Syria, and Syria, has been at the heart of this Ba'athist movement because all of the ideologues of the Baathists come from Syria, right? We're talking about Michel Aflaq, Zeki al-Arsouzi, all of these individuals are from Syria. So in 1963, they actually eventually stage a wholly Ba'athist military coup, and they ban all of the other political parties. So there's a single party system in Syria, but there are intra-conflicts between the Ba'athist party. There's another military coup in 1966, as you mentioned, and eventually Hafez al-Assad, who was the Minister of Defense, he stages this kind of final Ba'athist coup in Syria in 1970 and consolidates the whole power in his hands.
As they say, the rest is history. 54 years later, his family finally toppled from power. So, yes, Hafez al-Assad, as you say, had to wage several internal battles before finally achieving full power in 1970. I'll just share something here from William Cleveland's book, A History of the Modern Middle East. Assad, who was born in 1930, by the way, admired Nasser and supported the notion of Arab unity. However, he was dismayed over Egypt's domination of the Union and was especially upset at Nasser's insistence that the Syrian Ba'ath Party be dissolved. Assad's outlook was not improved when he was assigned to a meaningless post in Cairo, presumably because the Egyptian authorities regarded him as a potential troublemaker. During Assad's time in Cairo, he became involved with other like-minded young Syrian officers in a clandestine organization that plotted for the revival of the Ba'ath Party in their homeland. Their opportunity came in the 2 years of political chaos that followed Syria's secession from the UAR, the United Arab Republic, in 1961. So he was then at odds with the towering Nasser. Who are the Alawites? A Shia minority in a Sunni Islam country. How was this man able to achieve power coming from a small sect?
I will answer that question, but I want to add just one important thing on kind of the Arab Cold War. I think it's important. There's competition between Egypt and Syria for the leadership of the Arab world. There's also competition between Syria and Iraq for the leadership of the Arab world, like during the Cold War. So if you remember, during the Iraq-Iran war, which started in 1980, Syria was actually supporting Iran. That was, pretty much a power move in the region. Even like, in the 1991 First Gulf War, Syria supported the US, right? So I think we need to also understand the regional balance of power and Syria's attempt to kind of assert this leadership role in the Arab world, their involvement in 1967, Six-Day Arab-Israeli War, 1973 Arab-Israeli War. So they're attempting to assert this leadership role in the Arab world.
Assad the father, his primary foreign policy goal was war with Israel. And by 1991, I guess he had become so upset with Saddam Hussein, he wanted to stick his finger in Saddam's eye, so he supported Operation Desert Shield or Operation Desert Storm to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait.
Which actually created a lot of resistance in Syria itself, because at the time, a lot of Syrian intellectuals were sympathizing with Saddam.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some important milestones on the way here. The 67 war, the 73 war. I mean, these were massive and humiliating failures for the Arab world, were they not?
Exactly. So they were humiliating for Syria as well. And those failures or defeats undermined Hafez al-Assad's kind of assertion of leadership in the Arab world. And eventually in 1976, he gets involved in this Lebanese civil war to actually restore his regional power, right? So in Lebanon, there's a civil war which lasted like 15 years. He supports the Lebanese front, right? The Maronite militias in order to weaken PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and its leftist allies. So, and there is an occupation of Lebanon by Syria, which lasted 30 years from 1976 to 2005 until the Sadr revolution in Lebanon. And then, Lebanese people demanded the withdrawal of Syrian troops in Lebanon in 2005. And eventually Syria withdrew from Lebanon.
Yeah, since you brought that up, what was Syria's interest in occupying and dominating Lebanon for so long?
Maybe the rise of PLO to power in Lebanon could have led to a kind of complete invasion of Lebanon, right? So maybe he wanted to avoid that completely. That's kind of like one plausible explanation. And I think, since this pro-Palestinian cause was his main kind of political rhetoric, perhaps he didn't want to lose it. Like if PLO came to power in Lebanon, perhaps Hafez al-Assad would not be in a position to own this whole cause, so to speak, for the Arab world, because for a long time, pro-Palestinian activism and foreign policy has made kings in the Arab world, right?
So you're saying Hafez al-Assad, he was married to the Palestinian cause? It seems like he had an ambiguous relationship with it based on what you just said.
The country fought two wars for the Palestinian cause, 1967 and 1973. On the one hand. On the other hand, he was fighting against PLO and its leftist allies in Lebanon, right? So I think it's a very complicated situation here, and it's difficult to explain.
What did the Baathists believe in? They were socialists of a kind, right?
Baathist ideology tried to integrate various elements of secular nationalism, socialism. They were nationalists, right? So Arab nationalists, and they wanted to unite the Arab world. And they introduced a lot of socialist policies as well. In Syria, for example, Hafez al-Assad nationalized most of the industries. And interestingly enough, Giuliani has just commented on this and said that he wants to open Syria to kind of free market and international investment. So these ideas of free market are coming from an Islamist now in Syria. I'm not sure if they're going to actualize or not, but this is just an irony and paradox, and I wanted to bring that up. So it was a popular ideology throughout the Cold War. The Baathist parties emerged in Iraq and in Syria. So there was a fierce competition between these Baathist political parties. When we kind of come back to the question of Alawites in Syria, I think that's an important question as well. Let's also talk about Alawites as a religious community. So this is a branch of Shia sect of Islam, right? Alawites has this mystical interpretation of Quran, not literal interpretation of the Quran, right? So a mystical interpretation of the Quran. They venerate Ali ibn Talib, Prophet Muhammad's cousin, and they believe that he was a physical manifestation of God on earth. And for a long time in the Muslim world, historically, Alawites have been persecuted and marginalized, subjugated. In Syria, during the French mandate, the French recruited Alawites, Jews, and other religious minorities into the army because they thought like they would be more loyal to them compared to, the Sunni majority, divide and conquer kind of policy in Syria. And then when Hafez al-Assad came to power, as we mentioned, right, he's coming from this Alawite family. In 1973, he introduces this like secular constitution, which leads to, the uprising in Hama in 1976 and the Hama massacre in 1982. But most of the individuals that he puts into the positions of power in the military and intelligence come from Druze and Alawite families, right? So he played on the ethnic and religious differences in the country. For a long time, he wanted to appeal to both the majority and minority groups, but the massacre in Hama in 1982 brought the regime into an open conflict with the Islamists, right? So Islamists never forget about Hama. That happened in 1982. If you have seen some of the images coming out of Hama today, like individuals were openly referring to the 1982 Hama massacre. So these are, people who were born in 1980s and grew up with the memories of the massacre, right? So
history lives within all of us. That's 42 years ago, right? He is remembered even in the West, probably most of all for what he did in 1982, talking about Hafez al-Assad, the father here, murdering thousands of people, chemical weapons to put down that uprising. When he took power in 1970, according to William Cleveland, he did also want to govern in a cautious and more pragmatic way. As Cleveland writes, his pragmatism was evident in the moderate way he applied Ba'athist principles and in the attempts he made to broaden the base of popular support for his regime. Now, whether he was successful at this over time is another question. When he seized power in 1970, Syria's economy was predominantly agrarian-based, and the country's leading cash export was cotton. During the first decade of Assad's rule, the economy shifted to one dominated by the service, industrial, and commercial sectors, and oil replaced cotton as the main source of foreign exchange. Did Assad, while obviously there was no political or intellectual freedoms under his rule in Syria, he was a cruel dictator, did he succeed at least modernizing the country at all?
His success here is a relative term, right? So if you're comparing his success in terms of the ability to consolidate power and maintain an authoritarian rule in Syria, he has been really successful. And when Hafez al-Assad came to power, he was definitely a pragmatist leader, definitely understood the ethnic and religious tensions within the Syrian society. And then he was able to placate and appeal to, as I said, like to minorities as well as the majority to some extent, right? So he initially, like the land reform that he introduced, understanding the tensions between landed elites, city and urban elites, and peasants, right? So he's introducing land reforms to be able to get the support of the peasants, not only Alawites, but also Sunni peasants, right? Most of the, industries were nationalized, as I said, state subsidized education, state subsidized healthcare. All of these policies will also, bring some level of support to the regime. And the transformation from an agrarian society to an industrialized society, that might be a little bit of an overstretch. He introduced industrial policies, but I would say to a large extent they failed. Syria is still a country that exports crude oil, right? So if we are talking about the Syrian economy, 1/4 of GDP comes from agriculture and 1/4 of GDP comes from oil exports, right?
So 1/4 from farming, 1/4 from oil.
Before the Syrian civil war, most of the economic activities have stopped to a large extent during the war, right? So that the cities have been leveled, right? So as you can imagine, and half of the population has been displaced, 500,000 people, have been killed. So you can't have a stable economy, in a civil war. But before the civil war, 1/4 of the Syrian economy was based on agriculture and 1/4 was based on oil. And today, most of the oil refineries in Syria are in eastern Syria, in Deir ez-Zor, which was being controlled by SDF and recently captured by other opposition factions. Interestingly, President-elect Trump made a comment the other day, and he said, we're in Syria also for oil because we're supporting SDF's fight against ISIS, which still, remains in some parts of Syria. But also, there are important oil resources in eastern Syria, which we want to protect. So Syria has never been a major oil exporter in the Arab world, right? So compared to Iraq and Saudi Arabia, oil revenues are not very high. But within its own economy, still, oil exports are important because 1/4 of GDP comes from oil exports.
Yeah. Well, something else got in the way of Assad's plans, such as they were to improve the lot of ordinary Syrians, and that was his commitment to armed struggle against Israel, diverted a lot of money away from domestic policy.
Domestic issues.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I'll just share another paragraph from William Cleveland here. He persuaded Syria's principal arms supplier, the Soviet Union, to increase the quantity and quality of weapons it provided. He launched a huge buildup of the Syrian armed forces that saw them grow from 50,000 in 1967 to over 400,000 in the early 1980s. Such an unprecedented expansion of the military was costly. By the early 1980s, Syria was devoting 20% of its gross national product to military expenditures. The arms purchases strained the country's economy and, says William Cleveland, consume funds that might otherwise have been invested in domestic projects. Again, for what, right? This illusion of defeating Israel and becoming, the military or the most powerful leader of the Arab world.
This is the international aspect of this military investment, but there's also domestic side, right? So
That's right. He needs the military. He needs a strong military to maintain power, right?
He is investing in the military, but also in the security apparatus to surveil and also maintain, a rule based on fear. So we're talking about thousands of people being capped in dungeons, in jails, to make sure that masses do not revolt. This whole obsession with, defeating Israel and also maintaining authoritarian rule within the country has made the regime to channel most of its economic resources to the military and made the country fail in other spheres of life.
So Hafez al-Assad dies in 2000. He was about 70 years old. When his son succeeds him, Bashar, he became the successor because another brother had died in a car accident. But when Bashar al-Assad takes power in 2000, there was some optimism about him, right? Here's from Encyclopedia Britannica. I want your thoughts on this before we wrap up. It says, although many Syrians objected to the transfer of power from father to son, Bashar's ascent engendered some optimism both in Syria and abroad. His youth, education, and exposure to the West seemed to offer the possibility of a departure from what had been the status quo, an authoritarian state policed by a network of powerful overlapping security and intelligence agencies, and a stagnant state-run economy reliant on shrinking oil reserves. In his inaugural speech, Bashar Assad affirmed his commitment to economic liberalization and vowed to carry out some political reform, but he rejected Western-style democracy as an appropriate model for Syrian politics. I wonder why. What happened? I mean, maybe this is a dumb question, but I don't know a lot about Syrian history. Why did the son rule like the father?
These are all great questions, actually. Just going back to Hafez al-Assad's plans for his potential successors, right?
Yeah.
His initial thought was kind of appointing his brother, Rifat al-Assad, as his successor. But Rifat al-Assad stages a coup against Hafez al-Assad in 1993, and he gets exiled. Perhaps Rifat al-Assad was his first choice. Then the second, potential choice as a successor was Basil, his oldest son, who died in a car accident in 1995. His third option is Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad was not an experienced politician. He graduated from a university in Damascus, but he spent most of his time in London. He was an ophthalmologist.
That's right. He was an eye doctor and had kind of a cosmopolitan upbringing.
Yeah, eye doctor in London. So all of a sudden in 2000, when his father dies, he finds himself in a situation to take over the regime in Syria. He's not prepared for it. He initially works with the old guard of his father, right? But he gradually replaces them and creates his own close circle. And then when he comes to power in 2000, as you alluded to, he makes promises, right? So economic liberalization, political reforms, all that he's not ready to introduce democracy. He's still kind of like, trying to appeal to some of the demands by the public, right? Economic liberalization and political reforms. He tries to deliver some of those, but I think during his first 10 years, right? We were talking about, or 11 years, from 2000 to 2011. He's not very successful, but there are breakthroughs in international relations of Syria, so to speak. There's normalization with Turkey and then withdraws from Lebanon in 2005, right? So he is following a different kind of foreign policy than his father to some extent, but he's not as much pragmatist. He's not as much experienced. When faced with, the uprisings in 2011, he's initially shocked, and he just applies the old playbook here.
Yeah, massive violence, torture.
And uses, the existing structures of intelligence and security apparatus in Syria. And eventually, the high hopes that the rest of the world had, because he was a vast and educated, expected to kind of introduce serious reforms in Syria. And even the Sunni majority had high hopes. I remember those days, right? People were actually favoring him. They liked him. They wanted him to do things for the country, but he could not deliver those. And in 2011, if you remember the revolution, the Syrian civil war, the Syrian uprising started in Daraa. There were 15 school children who chanted anti-regime slogans, and they were detained and tortured. And this is how the uprisings spread from Daraa to the rest of Syria.
The Syrian uprising started as peaceful demonstrations in the streets, and they were brutally...
And then they turned into a full-blown kind of civil war in a matter of a few years. Yeah.
So, Sefa, we did cover a lot of ground here. Last question. It is hard to put the Assad dynasty, if you will, into historical perspective. We're just a week or so since Bashar went to spend the rest of his life, presumably enjoying the winters in Moscow. But looking back on this last half century of rule, it's hard to see any positive legacy.
That's true.
Any positive legacy.
Syria gained its independence from France in 1946, right? So the last French troops withdrew from Syria in 1946. And between 1946 and 1970, Syria had been in a political upheaval and experienced 7 military coups, right? We're talking about a country that experienced 7 military coups in 14 years, right? More than 30 cabinets. There wasn't political stability, right? So the authoritarianism that was formed and maintained by Hafez al-Assad provided authoritarian stability for 54 years. If you call it stability, it has come at the end of Syrians being displaced, tortured, persecuted and subjugated and all of that. So the hope is, the creation of democratic stability in Syria. Ideally, that should be the next kind of phase or episode of Syrian history. But of course, if we are going to be realistic about this, we will see whether actually these hopes are going to be realized or not. But there are important differences and tensions between different factions. Human rights and democracy might not be the highest priority of some of these, opposition factions. But I guess at this point, by way of a conclusion, we can say that it's a moment to celebrate for the Syrian people the fall of the regime, right? So we're talking about a 13-year civil war and 54-year reign of Assad dynasty in Syria. But it's also realistic to think about what's going to come next and whether, these different opposition factions will be able to engineer peaceful transition and create a sustainable political system in Syria.
At the same time, we will do our part to support their aspirations for a Syria that is democratic, just, and inclusive. And we will stand up for their universal rights and dignity by pressuring the regime and Assad personally to get out of the way of this transition. All along, as we have worked to expand the circle of global condemnation, we have backed up our words with actions. As I've repeatedly said, it does take both words and actions to produce results.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, are the winds of change blowing through Georgia? Not the U.S. state, the former Soviet Republic. Protests as the central government there pulls away from its commitment to join the European Union. That is next as we report history as it happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter every Friday. Sign up at historyasithappens.com.